40 Studies That Change Psychology Summarized. Reading 1. One Brain or Two. This study focuses specifically on the brain and the two hemispheres, and if they act like one brain and working together, or two separate brains that are just coordinating between each other. To study this, the researchers focused on epileptic patients who had had their corpus callosum cut. Corpus callosum is the part of the brain that connects the two, so where all the information sharing happens. I won't go in detail of what the actual tests were, but the conclusion that they derived from those tests was essentially that the two hemispheres of the brain act like two separate entities and just share information between each other. For example, when the right hemisphere of the brain would receive some information, but it didn't have that pathway to send it to the left, the patient, even though they saw and when they did tests, they were able to conclude that the right side of the brain knew that information, they couldn't give it to the left, which where speaking was. So the patient wouldn't be able to actually speak that information, even though they knew that the information existed. This is supported that idea that on a macro level, we kind of have two brains and they're just coordinating with each other. Reading 2, which more experience equals bigger brain. This was a test to see that if the age-old myth of having more experience and being smarter actually leads to a bigger brain. So this experiment, what they did was that they focused on seeing if they exposed infants to different types of environments, going from normal to enhanced to lackluster, would it change the sizes and the weight of their brain. For this, they used rats, and the conclusion that they got was that at the end of those experiment periods, the rats with the better environments did actually end up with bigger and heavier brains. A couple criticisms of it, though, is that the different environments could have other confounding factors like increased stress for those who didn't have much to do. And on top of that, there's always a question of how well a rat's experience can actually translate into a human kid's experience. Reading 3, Are You a Natural? This focused on the age-old debate of nature versus nurture. Are our personalities based on our genetics, or are they focused more on our experiences throughout our life? This study ended up supporting the nature side of the argument. The researchers took twins who had been separated at birth through orphanages and then got them back together and did sets of personality tests. And repeatedly, over and over again, the twins would end up having very similar personality traits, even though they had grown up in completely different environments. This points to that conclusion that nature is actually more important than nurture, because the genetics within those twins are what caused them to grow up and to be predisposed to certain types of personalities. Reading 4, Watch Out for the Visual Cliff. This is more of a nuanced type of experiment, and it focused on the development of perception. They tested different animals, which between humans, chickens, goats, and turtles, among others, to see their ability to perceive depth at young ages. What they saw was that if a species needed the perception of depth for survival, like chickens or goats, then they would develop it much earlier and be much better at it, as opposed to something like turtles who developed it a lot later and were really bad at it. But if you think about it, it made sense because aquatic turtles didn't really need a perception of depth to survive. Reading 5, Take a Long Look. This goes into the next chapter, but it's about infants and their ability to perceive form, whether it's learned or whether they actually just have it at birth. And for this, the researchers tested by showing infants objects that had different forms, so something like a simple couple lines or a complex human face. And what they saw repeatedly was that the forms that were more complex or more like human faces were likely to be stared at by infants longer. And staring is infants' way of communicating that they're interested or see something that they like. So the conclusion that they came to in this experiment was that infants by birth had the ability to perceive form. And this is a step in the process of realizing that infants are a lot more complicated than we originally believed them to be. Before, we didn't even believe that infants could feel pain, but over time and over a couple of decades, we've realized that infants have a lot more going inside that leads to the way that they grow and they develop the way that they do. So that's going to be it. Readings 1 through 5 summarized. Make sure if you haven't subscribed already to go down and subscribe. Make sure to like if you liked and do all that other fun stuff. And until next time, see ya.